Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Brantley Smith, former member of IHOP-KC. Brantley, after we recorded the last one, we got so much positive feedback, and I've got a text message up here from a person who's asking me, when are we bringing Brantley back? You need to ask him this and that and the other. And even I think even Charles chimed in. He said, you got to get this guy back. There's so much insight into that movement that you bring, that your knowledge of it and your personality just kind of fits with mine, and I think it resonates with a lot of people.
I'm glad to hear that. I get a lot of encouraging messages, and that's the only thing I can hope for is that my experiences are helpful for someone. God knows it's been painful for us all, like detangling all this, and the fact that it can be helpful to people and help people on their journeys and maybe expedite the healing process for them brings me a lot of joy.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It helps people to see that people can come through this and come out somewhat normal on the other side. So, like, one of the questions, and I'll ask you now, how did you go through this and keep your sanity?
Man, it's a really good question. It's a lot of relationships and honestly how I was raised. I mean, there was some values, and that's always the trouble with detangling, is that the good and the bad can coexist in spaces. My upbringing was super fundamentalist, but because of that saved me from a lot of heartache and heartbreak. And I think that anybody that's in a high control environment, you hear people talk about the inner critic that's developed. You become very emotionally intelligent, but just by the side effect of always being introspective. And I think, and I encounter that more in the cult environment with my friends who exist in those cult environments than I do with a Joe that I meet on the street. I think we talked about it last time that we chatted, just the intelligence of some of the folks that are wrapped up in the cult. Like, some of the smartest people I know were people I met in the cult, which is kind of ironic. But I think it was the support systems that I had, my family and even friends and relationships I made within the cult. Some of them kept me in the cult, but I think, being seen in the different ways. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm gonna have to think on it some more, but that's my initial gut responses.
Well, my response is I didn't. I wouldn't call what I am and doing sane.
Oh, for sure. Let's talk about normal. What is normal?
What is? How do I find this thing that you call normal? Right. The other question. So, how and where did you meet your wife?
Oh man, so I met my wife in Kansas City. And it's kind of funny, and it's honestly, we look at it and we feel like we're beating statistics right now that we're still. So we've been married for 10 years, and we met, I think it was in 2011. She came out and did an internship at IHOP, and she was in Fire in the Night, so she did night watch for 6 months. And she audited our Book of Revelation class in IHOP-U, and there wasn't enough seats in the classroom. Stuart Greaves taught the class. There wasn't enough seats for the students, IHOP-U students, and the interns in the class. So the interns all had to sit on the floor. They were lower tier than the students. And so my wife and 3 of her friends were sitting in the floor next to me, and I went and added them all on Facebook because that's what you did in 2011. And we started chatting after she left IHOP, probably about a year and a half later after I was out as well. And we literally got married. It's like started dating. I think it was December of 2012, and we got married in May of 2013. So it was very, very quick. which, a lot of that is pressure from the purity culture and different things. I'd had a job offer in Texas, and where our beliefs were, we didn't think living together would be right. And so our options were either we were doing a long distance relationship. She had just moved close to me. And I got this job offer in Texas, and we were in Virginia, and we're like, well, we can either get married or we're going to be long distance again. So we decided to get married, and we got 2 girls, and it's been working out. And it's been interesting. It's been an interesting journey though, John, because the way that we've processed our past. So she grew up, I don't want to share too much of her story because it's her story, but she grew up in a super charismatic environment, in independent charismatic church in California, and her dad's a pastor. And so she has her own journey through all of this as well, where I had a little bit more of a Pentecostal upbringing, and we met cross paths at IHOP. But the way that we began detangling was very different. Both of us, it started, I think, heavily. We'd always been asking questions and stuff, but in 2020, and I think I talked about this a little bit last time about, me seeing how people were treating each other, and it's people that we were told to demonize by the church. But my deconstruction and stuff was very much more theologically based. And so I started having these big theological questions, where for my wife, her journey was very different, in that it was more justice oriented, and it was more how people were being treated. And even it's not even been until like the past 6 months or a year that she started looking at her beliefs even. And so we had moments where, I think I shared this publicly once before, so I think she's okay with it, where we've I looked at her, we were having a conversation, and I was like, if we get 30 years from now and I find out that all this Jesus stuff's a fairy tale, I was like, I think I'm going to be okay with the Jesus that I believe in, even if it's not true. And we're driving down the road, and I thought she was going to hop out of the car on me. And so she went through, she's like, what do you mean? I remember her hands on the dash. And I was like, I'm just saying, like, if it's not true, I don't know. Like, I'm not saying I don't believe it, but if it's not true, and we had 3 or 4 moments like that where, things came to a head, because it was the bedrock of our relationship. And, the way that we define marriage and look at relationships. I mean, it was, love your wife as Christ loves the church, lay down your life for one another. And some of those are good values, but whenever you start questioning these things, and Christ was the bedrock of your relationship, like, how do you start building a relationship outside of that? And so it's been a journey, it's been a challenge, but we're still going. We still like each other. And so
that's good. There's a lot of people that are going through similar. We were so manipulated to have faith in our faith, and with the elimination of critical thought. And so what you're describing, what happens if we discover something that makes us uncomfortable about Christianity or Jesus? Well, a lot of people, it's like a child walking through the graveyard whistling when there's an open grave. They can pretend all they want that there's no open grave, but inwardly they're still thinking about it, no matter how many times they whistle.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like going back to the believers in Berea who had to go out and prove all of the things. They were critically thinking. It's not that they had faith because they had faith, or because their parents were Christians, they decided they must be Christian too. They had the ability to question and think. And if you think about how that works, the mind works different ways. Like, I have a critical mind. My mind tries to prove the true by first examining the false. So I will, like whenever I began to examine the message of William Branham, I would assume something was false and then try to prove it true. So I would go down that path and then come back. Well, there's a lot of people that they think this way, and they've never, ever done it with religion. And the first time they do it, they come unglued. It's true. It's so funny.
Well, I had one of those moments myself where I had heard somebody question if Jesus was actually a historical figure, which I believe that Jesus was a historical figure. But at that moment, like, everything was, all my foundations were crumbling that had been raised on. And luckily I had a life coach. I had a little bit of wisdom at the moment, and I called him for an impromptu session because I was spiraling hard. And I was like, Logan, I don't know what to do. I was like, I don't know if Jesus was real, like, at all. And this and that. He's like, Brantley, you don't have to open that door unless you want to. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah. He's like, if you don't want to do that right now, you don't have to do that right now. And so I put it on a shelf for a while. I did for like 2 years. I didn't go there, but it's so disorienting. So disorienting.
It is. And the tools that they give you, like I'll never forget when you leave a cult like this, you begin to explore. A lot of people de-churchify. They call it now de-churchification or whatever. But you go down the path where you start to explore the other side because you've never been familiar with it. And one of the first things that I did is I read this book called Case for Christ. And good Lord, man. If there
Lee
were
Strobel?
Lee Strobel, and nothing against him, but if I'll say my opinion. In my opinion, if there was a book that would help you convert to an atheist, that was the book.
That was the book.
It was if you're critically examining anything and you take the way that book said to critically examine it, it was written as though a Christian were trying to corral other Christians. That's how it read to me. There was no critical thought whatsoever. And so I read this and I was like, you got to be kidding me. The best case for Christ is propaganda.
And that's the challenge with it all is so much, there's so much groupthink involved, even though some days I wonder if all of evangelicalism's a cult. But there's not room for that critical thought. Like all my ex-cult friends, I would say 80% of them have walked away from the faith completely. And it's not because they don't want to believe in God. Like some of them still probably call themselves agnostic and still have a spiritual expression to their life, and they want to believe these things. They still love Jesus. They still really like Jesus and the things that Jesus taught, but they can't find places where they can ask big questions. I mean, apologetics is all groupthink. In a sense, it's like we have this belief, let's see how we can defend it. And you start questioning that, and people, and all of a sudden you become a dissenter and they label you, and that's how they deal with you easily, is they call you a heretic or whatever, and now nobody can talk to you. So.
Yeah, and probably that is probably a good part of the reason why I came to that opinion, because when I left the cult, I also got deeply embedded into Christian apologetics. There were these back then. It wasn't Facebook groups or anything like this. They had these forums, and so I just joined one of the apologetics forums, and you could watch the back and forth between an atheist who's just angry at Christianity. He's so angry that they've shut off critical thought. And you watch an apologetic, some of them who I don't know, that maybe they were new and green to the field, but their answers were non-answers. They were, well, you must believe this because the Bible says this. And this guy is saying, well, I don't believe it because but you would get some real people who gave real answers. And so I could watch the dialogue, and I'm learning as I go. But my favorite ones were the ones who, whenever they got confronted with something that they had no answer to, they just simply said, hey, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. And that was an open and honest person, right? There were other people who would just try to defend it for the sake of defending it. And, the whole thing, it was just so surprising to me. But it made me go back to my own history and think about the way in which I was manipulated. We were, in the Branham cult, we were completely brainwashed. We went through series of techniques. They had a series of techniques that they used to manipulate our heads. And as you're going through all of this stuff, you're basically trained to shut off all critical thought, and you're trained to assume that whatever comes from behind the pulpit, you must agree with no matter what. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I wanted to have you back on the show to talk about exactly that, because as you probably have seen through the videos and articles I've been publishing, I'm trying to examine IHOP-KC from the standpoint of Paul Cain and Bob Jones and some of the others. Basically, we're reinventing Branhamism, taking Branham's name out, not telling people where they got it all from. But it was Branhamism 2.0 with a new spin on it. And so if it is, it must have these same characteristics. And lo and behold, the deeper I dig, I find every one of them. So one of them is the manipulation and the brainwashing is too narrow of a term. They have many techniques to control your mind, from, the music, etc. So I wanted to talk about this. What are your thoughts on just being manipulated in IHOP-KC?
It's such a hard thing to see initially. I mean, it's to see it, you literally have to wake up in a sense, and like you're saying with groupthink, like to dissent and have a different opinion, there's so much at risk in doing that. And I think that that's set up that way intentionally. Before you even get into like the little things, I mean, the social impacts that happen, and you're well aware of this because you see people come and go. And you know, when people leave, you don't hear from them again. It's not that they died. It's not that, you know, the majority of them are still in church somewhere, or maybe they left to go do ministry somewhere. But those relationships aren't existent anymore. That network is broken. In a place like IHOP, when you're so vulnerable, and what I mean by vulnerable is financially, having food on the table, stuff like that. A lot of people that they get away with it, I think, because so many of them are in the young adult college age demographic, which is already, you know, known for eating ramen. So that's not unusual to hear a bunch of 18 to 20 somethings eating ramen. I had friends that literally got sick from eating ramen too much. That they it was like something solid for 3 weeks that they ate ramen because they didn't have any money. And so I think that those just knowing what would happen if you were to come in and question eschatology, or in the position you had, the higher up you were, the more you had to lose. Myself, like I never was a leader over anything at IHOP, really. I was an assistant to a group leader for the internship, which just meant I was a glorified RA. So I got to live with the interns and tell them to clean their dishes and stuff like that. So wasn't anything too glorious. But if you were a teacher at IHOP-U, or you were a worship leader on a worship team, or you ran an internship, any of those things, and you were to start questioning these things. I've heard so many stories where IHOP would remove their pay is what would happen. Like, and we're not talking like people who make, I highly doubt hardly anybody made more than 20 grand a year. Like, we're not talking big amounts of money. I think the biggest stipend, IHOP stipend I've heard to date was $1,200 a month. The majority of them were $300 to $500 a month. And you figure the whole time that I was there, renting a bedroom cost me around $350 to rent a bedroom in a house. And so if you were to dissent and start to question things, and all of a sudden you lost that $500 a month, that was significant. And it wasn't that they were firing you. They didn't fire you. They would just reallocate you somewhere. They would reassign you somewhere. And unfortunately, that position wouldn't have a stipend. And so there was so much real subtle things like that. That just to hear that somebody moved from being a worship leader to something else, and that they lost their stipend because of it, wouldn't make you think a whole lot. You go, yeah, because worship leaders are the backbone of this thing. They get money and marketing people don't, or whatever it might be. And so that's like the initial things that come to mind is the social impacts of the relationships you lose. And that was just a threat. That wasn't even an outright manipulation, if you will, but I think that kept so many people in positions of powerlessness.
Yeah. And that was one of the things that you mentioned that really got me to thinking about the similarities between the two, because in Branhamism, there were multiple layers to this. The groupthink is something that is normal across every group of people. You get a group of people together and they continually interact with each other. And if they're not interacting with diversity, difference of opinion, they're going to develop in a certain way. And that's literally why culture exists. You have people in South Asia who think differently than people in America, because that's the way that the groupthink works. But in Branhamism and all of the different cults that spun off of it, there was another layer on top of that. There were men who realized the power of the groupthink, but also realized how to manipulate the groupthink. So as the group, like you're talking about, so they don't have a lot of money. That was largely the case in Branhamism. And a lot of the people, because they were a cohesive group of people, there would be employers who would employ people from the cult, and only people from the cult. So they had their job because they were connected to cult people. And if they were to be kicked out of the cult, they would lose their job, lose their livelihood. And so you'd have these cult manipulators that would say, if you don't agree with this doctrine, the door's right there. I've heard that from a church. I mean, what preacher says this, right? But I've actually heard that statement from a church.
Yep.
And to the people who are in the groupthink model, it's devastating, man, because if they're going to kick me out because I disagree, well, I'm going to lose my job, my house, my cars, my kids I won't be able to provide for my children, right? So they were manipulators that got into that. And the problem is, it appears to be, for me, at least from what I can see, it appears to be a strategy.
There were so many messages that were core to IHOP that you talked about shaping the groupthink. The one that I'm seeing now, and I don't have, you're the research guy. I don't have all the research and stuff, but this is my opinion. Whenever I was a part of the movement, one of the things, the groupthink topics that shaped us a lot, was always who your enemy was. That was always a thing. And I've noticed, especially since Roe v. Wade was overturned, I've noticed a subtle shift of what those enemies are. Whenever I was in Kansas City, it was always abortion and homosexuality. Like those were the enemies. They're doing gay conversion therapy, and they were going and protesting abortion clinics and standing on the steps of the Supreme Courthouse and such. And now I've seen that change to now it's around, and people have many different opinions around this issue, but around gender identity and trans people, and bathrooms and all this, we hear it in the news all the time as well. Like the religious portion of society has so much sway in there. But those are one of the subtle things that I see that they paint a target and get us thinking one way, and you never actually have conversations with these people. You never have a conversation with someone who had to have an abortion. You never had a conversation with someone who identified as gay or someone who was trans, or the list goes on and on. But there was much more strategic stuff too. The one I've been thinking about the most recently, intimacy with God, was a huge theme, which is a whole thing we could dive into with Bridal Paradigm and Song of Solomon and all that kind of thing. But before you even got into the weird stuff, like the things that most preachers in America would agree with whenever they heard Mike talk about it, is he would talk about the first and second commandment. And he would talk about the importance of the first commandment, that we would love God with everything, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But what people didn't notice was the subtle pitting of the two, of the first commandment and the second commandment. The second one's like it, that you love your neighbor as yourself. And we see through the rest of Scripture, again, my opinion, we see through the rest of Scripture, look at Matthew 25, and Jesus talks about whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. But with a place like IHOP, you construct a whole worldview and theology and system around this prayer room and intercession and worship and all these things. And whenever you hear that first commandment message, now prayer room, worship, all this stuff becomes the most important things, because this is how we love God. And what we've seen happen as a result was the neglect of people in the community around us. I'm not even talking about the homeless population of Kansas City or the food insecure in Kansas City. I'm talking about the cult members. Like, we saw that it was more important that you kept your Sacred Trust prayer room hours. Or Sacred Trust was like your 40 hours or 24 hours if you're a student that you committed to in the prayer room a week. That was more important than any relationship, because first commandment was most important. Loving God was more important than your family, more important than your friends. And so I've had to do a whole lot of detangling in that regard. But that's one of those subtle manipulation things of you define something for people and you give them a goal to hit. Like, they're going to do everything they can to do that. If you say that that's what's pleasing to God, that it's pleasing to God that you do this. And there was a whole lot more subtle stuff to it around, justice and how they define justice, which impacted the loving your neighbor portion. That if it wasn't prayer, worship, evangelism, you could go feed as many people as you want. But if you fed people and didn't tell them about Jesus, you were the Antichrist. And they would say that verbatim from the platform. So there's so much subtle stuff like that. That now, I left in 2012. We're 12 years later, and I'm just now detangling that whole message in the past 6 months or so.
It's a lot to detangle because, like you said, they want to have an enemy. It's an us versus them mentality. They have to have an enemy. And it's like, it's not that that's limited to the cult. Look in politics. If you can incite anger in a crowd and get them to hate something, and then say that your platform is the one that solves the issue that's causing this hate, you've united the people, and anger is very powerful. Even the prophet Yoda said, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate. And the problem is they don't realize the last part of that, hate leads to suffering. And you look at the similarities between the two, IHOP-KC, Branhamism, and then all of the movements historically that sparked Branhamism. They begin with fear, which the prophet Yoda explained to us. You get the people to fear something, then you can turn them to turn anger against it, and then eventually to hatred. And it's always that strategy to manipulate the crowd. And I'm not going to say that Bickle and some of these others are listening to the prophet Yoda, but there's a pattern that you can look through from politicians to just ancient history. That's the way in which you take a group of people in a mind think type scenario and then turn them into an army. And that's exactly what they did here. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started? Or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
You mix in the visions of grandeur kind of idea that gets swept up too. There's so many big pictures painted. You mentioned Joel's army, and I start thinking about all the prophetic history and stuff. One of the big parts of that was that there would be this big Blue Ridge procession, is what they called it, where it was going to be apostles and prophets marching from Forerunner Church in Grandview to Arrowhead Stadium. and that was a big thing. And they've tried to self-fulfill that a couple times, most recently, like 2 years ago, where they tried to do a thing and did this big, they rented out Arrowhead Stadium. And it was kind of sad because they did a lot of image management around it. I don't know how, I'd hate to guess, but the stadium wasn't more than 20% full. They packed everybody on the field around the stage and stuff, and then you look up and you're like, man, this place is empty. But it was a huge push. But whenever you set those were the things that were set in front of us that kept us in the fire. I like that metaphor. That you would be the big worship leader, you would be the apostle, you would be the prophet. And there's so many friends that are coming to mind right now who had those exact things spoken over them. I had a friend who they're like, you're going to be one of the apostles in the Blue Ridge procession. Like, that's what was prophesied over him. Or you're going to be the next this worship leader or that worship leader. And that's how they kept you there, was that.
It all comes down to control. If you can control the people, you can point them wherever you want and turn them into your army and do your bidding. And that's essentially what was happening here. You talked about...
And it's so subtle.
Oh, yeah. You talked about renting Arrowhead Stadium. I remember when I was a kid, most of the people who are in the Branham cults will probably not even remember this, but the end time was near because Bill Clinton got elected. It's so weird how politics ties into all of this.
I went through Obama at IHOP, and it was the same thing. It was the same thing.
So yeah, same thing. So, and I think the Branham cults did too with Obama. But anyway, Bill Clinton was elected, so therefore the end is nigh, and the saints are. They would use this phrase: the saints are gathering together. And they rented it wasn't nearly as big as the football stadium, but they rented one of the buildings over in Louisville, and everybody from all over the country came, and it was so packed but yet so unfilled that they had to put up like curtains so that you didn't see all the empty seats everywhere. And I remember I was young and I'm walking in, and this building's a little odd. Why do they have those curtains up? And I'm sitting there. In Branhamism, you're listening to this recording of this dead guy from the 60s. So I'm, counting the ceiling tiles and looking around at everything that's going on. And it suddenly dawned on me, oh, it's because there's so many empty seats, and this would look like this little tiny crowd. And I had that level of critical thought, even though I had blocked almost all critical thought. But it's all for the appearance, because if you can get the people to believe in whatever is the fantasy you're creating, then turn them to anger and hatred, then you've empowered them as your army.
Yeah. That image management stuff happened all over the place at IHOP. Even in the day-to-day. They would rope off aisles in the prayer room because they had their 24/7 live stream, which, still going and has been probably one of their biggest recruiting tools. It's such a resource for churches that want to pray. Like, you can go turn this on anytime. It's free. But they would give instructions to the media team, like, don't show empty chairs. We do not show empty chairs. That's not what we do. And so they would rope off sections. And if you went and sat in one of the roped off sections trying to get away from people, just trying to get some space to yourself, man, an usher would hunt you down. They'd make you move. They would. It was crazy. The fear piece is... I keep saying using the word subtle, but I don't know another way to describe the techniques that they use. I think last time, whenever I was on, I talked about, they don't drive up in white vans and black outfits and drag you away. Like, it's not what they do. But there's so many points of fear. It's not just fear of losing social circles. It's not just, fear of finances. It's fear of eternal destination. It was fear of, you had the whole heavenly rewards message. So it was fear of your proximity to Jesus. That's what Mike would teach. That depending on how you lived in this life would determine your proximity to Jesus in the age to come, which would cause people to endure mistreatment in ways. If they let these people train POWs, like, I don't think people would break. Like, the way that they teach them to endure mentally, and even the stories that I've heard of someone being mistreated by a leader, and them just telling them, well, you're just in Joseph's dungeon, like, that's just where you are right now, or you're out in the caves somewhere, You're going through that tough season. You're wandering around the wilderness. And so that was another tactic that was used to instill fear was, what was going to happen in the age to come based on the way that Mike talked about it. He said, we got this 60-year internship. That's what he would say. He goes, you got 60 years here to determine how you're going to spend forever. And you tell somebody that, and they start doing the math. If you're and you're a smart person and you do the math there and you believe it and you go, okay, like, short-term suffering versus like eternity. that really resonates with people, and you'll see people do some crazy stuff for that. It's all encompassing, and the longer I stare at it, the more I see it everywhere. I mean, there's the fear with the eschatology piece. There's the fear of, with intimacy with Jesus, the way that it was put in front of you was, we talk about Matthew 25, not the least of these, but we would talk about the oil in the lamps and the virgins, the 10 virgins, and back tied into that first commandment thing. You had to be, the only way you got oil in your lamp was through prayer and fasting. Like that's how you got intimacy with Jesus, was prayer and fasting. And so you had this constant thing of like, man, is my oil lamp empty? Like, am I running on empty? And so you had this constant just hypervigilance. I didn't know that word then, but I now know it now that I'm processing trauma, because I still feel it sometimes, where I just get obsessive and just do everything I can to for certain tasks and ideas. And it's crazy.
It is. And that's one of the things that really fascinated me from our last conversation. And you hit the nail on the head. If the Army could do this to the troops, we would have an impossible to stop. There'd be an army that would be impossible to stop. I have been studying, as you know, Christian identity, how it led to all of this, and I began to see patterns emerging from the early years of it, in that they were choosing people who were in the military to come and speak in religious arenas for this British Israelism Christian identity. So you're getting military minds.
You're going to get me in trouble, John. You're going to get me in trouble.
I know. Well,
Go ahead,
it gets... I'm leading you up to it, I think. But one of the things that I began to notice this pattern, there's a pattern of manipulation of the body that ties into the manipulation of the mind. If you think military, one of the first things that you do when you enter the military is they want to break you down, and they're going to drill. You got a drill sergeant who's exercising you to death, very, very little sleep, and your body's going to a state of self-preservation. And when it does, you become like a child, and then the drill sergeant becomes like your parental figure, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they can't do that in a church because everybody would flip out. But what they can do is manipulate the body in other ways, like the fasting. Mm-hmm. And in Branhamism, you actually had it a lot worse in many ways than we had, because they had long forgotten that technique. Branham, when the latter reign began, it was William Branham and Franklin Hall, and that combination of Branham's mental techniques with Franklin Hall's fasting techniques was able to break the body down. You had the mental ways in which you engaged meditation with Branham, and then with Franklin Hall, it was this atomic power with God through fasting and prayer, they called it. But what it essentially did is it broke you down from the fasting part, and then using New Age techniques of meditation, which Branham was bringing in, the combination of that is exactly what they would do in the military without the push-ups.
The reason I said you're going to get me in trouble before I get a chance to throw this punch, because I want to, that's what was very infuriating to a lot of us, was after all the Mike Bickle stuff broke, the guy who's the chair of the board now is a retired major general who had his own scandals that followed him. He was honorably discharged, but there was some very suspicious stuff that went on, and I don't want to libel or slander anybody.
Tell us more.
but it was interesting. I mean, it was a civilian casualty type thing that was it was ruled that it was necessary force and stuff, but it's very suspicious. But this guy's come in here and tried to, and nobody knows him, and that's the thing. Like, the IHOP leadership team, like, we all know who these people were. And as soon as the scandal broke, all of a sudden we had these new faces, enforcers coming in who were going to save face, who had no connection to the community. They didn't know us. Because that's the thing, like, all these leaders, like, I don't know that Mike would know who I am. But all the other ones, Dave, Sliker, Stuart Greaves, like if I were to walk up to them right now today, they would know who I am, just because I spent 4 years there. I was in their classes at IHOP-U. I've had conversations with them on social media through the years, but there was this huge distancing. But that's an aside. But you mentioned atomic power of prayer and fasting. Are you familiar? So I used to have like 5 copies of this book. I think it was Derek Prince, I think is who it was, Shaping the World Through Prayer and Fasting or something like that.
Yeah.
Lou Engle went on this kick, who is in the IHOP sphere. Lou is. He's been a part of IHOP and not a part of IHOP, in and out. And he's the one who does all those big stadium Christianity stuff, the one doing the call events and stuff, and big fasting guy. But he would give this book out for free. It was out of print. And he got thousands of this book printed, and you would go to conferences. I mean, I got my first copy in Alabama at a youth conference, at a place called The Ramp, which is a whole other probably cult in itself too. And then whenever I got to Kansas City, they were handing out those books again. And it was just talking about the atomic power of prayer and fasting. Like that was kind of some of the words that were used. Fasting was used at IHOP, and I don't think that I've processed that in the ways that I have other areas, but there were leaders, Alan Hood, who has shown himself to be doing the work of trying to become a healthy leader now post IHOP. But I remember him talking about an encounter he had with God at one point, and he looked at us. I can't remember if it was a service or an IHOP-U like chapel service or something like that, but it was a room full of people. All the students were there, and he said that God told him if he didn't fast at least 2 days a week, that he would be useless to him in the days to come, in the last days. And Alan put that as a charge to all of us, and there was a couple things that happened there. If you didn't fast, you had the guilt and the shame over your head for not fasting and knowing that you weren't going to be useful to the Lord, because God told Alan, if you don't fast at least 2 days, and we believed that. And that was reinforced in the Forerunner commitments, which was something that shaped, I think, probably like around 2010 or so. They did a big One Thing conference on it, and they came up with the 7 commitments of a Forerunner, which I think actually, yeah. I have the book still sitting here from the other day. We were talking about it. So they got the 7 commitments of a Forerunner by Mike Bickle. And one of them was fasting was the thing. I'm trying to say fast weekly, positioning ourselves to receive more from God. And that's the way that it was pitched, is that if you jump through these hoops and you do these certain things, you will get more of God than somebody else. And that was kind of the goal that was put in front of us. But the thing that wasn't talked about is, and something I'm glad that you've brought up time and time again, is the mental and physical impacts of fasting. So we had that fast weekly thing that was a part of the culture. Tuesdays was most everybody's fasting day. That was kind of like the quote unquote staff fasting day. I can't remember if it was the first 3 or last 3 days of the month that we would do the global bridegroom fast, which was something that Mike created. So I think it was January through November, we would do 3 days a month. And then in December, they would do a week. And then if you add that up, it's 40 days over the year. So they would do this broken up 40-day fast over the year. And it was, I mean, nobody was going to kick you out if you didn't fast, but it was an expectation that you fasted for these things. And I mean, so much to the point, I think it got better in later years, but there was a point where the kitchen for the interns and stuff didn't serve food on fasting days. I think it got a little bit better later. They'd put out PB&J sandwiches and stuff, or leftovers from the day before or something like that for interns who couldn't fast. And they got a little bit better around that. But those were the things that were already just built in. And then you add the dynamic of, say, IHOP-U had a ministry trip coming up, which happened, once a year or so at least, where the whole school would get deployed somewhere. We went to Boston. We went to Peoria, Illinois one time. Went to San Diego when I was a part of it. I went to Jacksonville once. So I went to a couple different places on trips like this. And a lot of times they would call fast beforehand. So they would do like a 21-day Daniel fast or something like that, you know. And I remember so many times trying to take on these big fasts. I never could do it. I don't know if I didn't care enough to do it. I don't think it was part of it. But then you would have guys like Lou Engle, who was a presence in the community. If Lou, and it was always a joke too, whenever Lou spoke and then people knew ahead of time Lou was going to speak, we're like, well, here comes a 40-day fast, because that was just the way that it went. And so I feel like there was always like a fast going on, always. And it wears you down. It does. It wears you down. It causes, you know, I mean, you just go read a benefits of fasting and side effects of fasting from a medical journal, and you can see the brain fog and all the stuff that happens. Like, it's not hidden information, but if somebody doesn't help you connect those dots and see that connection, I don't think people see it. I don't.
No. I've caught a lot of heat over the years whenever I talk about fasting as a tool for manipulation, because the Bible talks about fasting. And what people in these types of movements don't realize is that it's not limited to Christianity. You can go study Eastern mysticism. You can find they use fasting as well. And there are techniques to enter this state where your mind is not as present in this world as it could be. And that's what these cults have tried to do. They capitalize on the fact that your mind does go into this cloudy state and you're not thinking clearly. When you're not thinking clearly, you cannot engage critical thinking. Yeah. And it's not that I'm even against fasting. In fact, a few years ago, I fasted for 40-something days. I lost 44 pounds in 44 days, basically. I was pre-diabetic at that time, and I was trying to head it off at the pass, and eventually it didn't work, but I lost a lot of weight and I've kept it off. So fasting has good aspects, right?
It's a both and thing. I mean, it's what we started the conversation talking about. That's what's the difficult part to see, is that the good and the bad can coexist together. Yeah. That something good can cause a lot of harm.
Oh yeah. And speaking of that, I said beforehand I wasn't going to mention John Wimber, but you mentioned Derek Prince and his fasting book, and I put John Wimber in the same category as Derek Prince. Everybody, anytime I mention Derek Prince, they say, well, he's distanced himself from the shepherding movement. He washed his hands. He's clean. And my response is, man, if I were to go at the top of a hill and find the rowdiest group of teenage boys who are angry at the world and hand them the keys to a bulldozer and start it down the hill towards a neighborhood, and then jump off halfway through and say, okay, you guys have fun, but this is wrong. I'm not going to do it. Who's guilty, right? And you've got men like this who they're doing some very bad things, and the fact that they step away and say, no, my hands are clean, it doesn't clean their hands. And this fasting thing began, you know, you can go back through time and you can find it through cults predating this, but it was very, very effective in igniting the Latter Rain movement. And they were igniting a movement with Christian identity, with the intent to reclaim the so-called mountain of government. They were unhappy with the U.S. government whenever all this was going on. So they, like today, there are a lot of similarities, but they were creating a Christian army to reclaim and take dominion over the nation. It began to change over time, obviously, but one of the ways in which they did that was they had everybody in this fasting, whether you want to or not, and it was extremism. It really was.
Yeah. It's crazy because I agree 100%. I mean, as a teenager, before even going to IHOP or anything like that, like, I experienced the shepherding stuff. I don't know if it was to the degree that Prince and different ones were engaging in it, but our youth group operated in a way that we didn't do anything without our youth pastor's permission, whether that was friendships or jobs or relationships, dating relationships. That was the big one. You had to go ask the youth pastor's permission before you could date someone. All of that definitely impacted us. And that's and even like with Wimber, I'm talking about that's one of the, the conundrum of being in a cult is you see people who, have good intentions get swept up. And I don't know Wimber. I don't know that he had good intentions or whatever, but just because they are good people with good intentions doesn't mean that they don't have a trail of bodies behind them. Oh, yeah. And that's the hard thing to reckon with. You talk about Wimber. He platformed the prophets. Like, that's what he did. I sent you before yesterday. One of my friends shared it with me of a rock opera album that was made called The Great Prophet. You can look it up on Spotify by a band called LS Underground. They used to be called the Lifesavers is what they were called. But then they got booted out of Christian bookstores and stuff. But it's the music is about this guy's experience with Vineyard platforming the prophets, the Kansas City Prophets and Mike Bickle, and them coming to town and the havoc that it wreaked. And you can find like liner notes and stuff online about it, them sharing the stories and stuff of that was said to some young women, that they would end up prostitutes out on Sunset Boulevard if they didn't come and join the movement, if they didn't give themselves to these things. And that's like Mike was talking about the House of Prayer stuff, like there's so much stuff that he says he never intended to do that just, was God. It was divine, that I'm like, no, like he was trying to do the prayer and worship stuff for a long time. And he had worship leaders that he was training and grooming, and he was starting his little model back then of prophetic singing. And, but that's a whole tangent, but all that to say, like, that wouldn't have happened if Wimber wouldn't have given them access. On the back end, like Wimber tried to discipline them. And if you look at Wimber's response comparatively to how we see, IHOP-KC responding to the Mike Bickle allegations, or Gateway Church in Texas handling the Robert Morris stuff, or any of these contemporary examples, like you look at what Wimber did, and I go, man, he responded really well, and he dropped a hammer on those guys. But the fact of the matter is he was the one who opened the door to begin with, and it didn't close it by doing that.
Yeah, it's so crazy. I looked at that video you sent, and it reminded me. I didn't mention this in the last episode, but the way that this thing has manipulated the heads, it has messed a lot of people up. And one of the themes that we talked about last time was overcoming this. And I'm not going to say that this is the best example of overcoming, but one of the people that the Latter Rain movement messed up greatly was Axl Rose.
Really?
I was reading. Yeah, I was reading. What was that? It might have been Rolling Stones. Anyway, I was reading and said he came out of a Pentecostal church, and I'm like, the curiosity got better me. So I started digging to find where it is. I actually have a research page of Axl Rose on my website. I found the church, and I found one of the speakers, and it was the speaker that linked it to Latter Rain, because this was a Latter Rain speaker that was coming to the church that he grew up in. And I started reading about the similarities. They had the choir and the singing, and he did the fake falsetto whenever he was in that church because he got bored with the music. I did the same exact thing, man. And so whenever he hit it big, he was just using his church choir, Latter Rain church choir falsetto voice, got him famous. So again, it's not the best example of an overcomer, but he did, move past this. I'll say it like that.
Yeah. Man, this is an interesting dynamic too, though. It's so funny to see how these groups laud certain individuals whenever they start ascribing to some of the beliefs or some of the things. Like, I remember there was a huge thing back when the Transformer movies were coming out, and there was articles released that Megan Fox spoke in tongues. And because Megan Fox spoke in tongues, all of a sudden everybody was going nuts. And, the same thing happened with Katy Perry whenever she, went on her rise. And she came out with these songs, and people started talking about, she's demonic, this and that, because she had left. I think her dad was a Pentecostal pastor. I think that's what it was. And because she had left that, and now she was singing about a black horse, or dark horse, whatever her song is. Everybody's like, oh, demons.
People ask me if I speak in tongues, and I say usually when I'm under my car working and I hit my hand with a wrench really hard, You might hear it. All the joking aside, they really have these techniques to control your head down to an art. It's a fine science for them. And in fact, my opinion, and it's just my opinion, but my opinion is they actually study the techniques of how to control you more than they study the Bible. And that's evident from the sermons that they preach, because most of what they preach is not even in it. And I question whether some of these guys even have cracked the cover open to see what's in the Bible. But anyway, the manipulation techniques, you use the word subtle. I use the word devious. Like these minds are thinking how to manipulate you at all times, and they want to get in your heads. When I went back and I began to analyze the sermons, and even still today, people will send me things to analyze, and I look at it and I think, good Lord, man, if I were a normal person who came out from any of the other churches and wanted to visit this place, it's so evident that they want to manipulate your head. A normal person is not going to sit there very long. They're going to say, this place is whacked out, and just get up and leave. But the shocking part for me was that while I recognize that in the Branham movements, I start looking at Mike Bickle and some of the others at IHOP, and they're doing the same exact things.
Yeah, there was so much lack of original thought from leaders there. Everything, it seemed, came from Mike. Everyone, and it was funny, we this is totally unrelated. We were talking about earlier this week in one of our support groups about, we had this guy that was kind of like a flat earther creationist, but we all got obsessed with it and kind of latched onto it just because it was something new. It was something novel. It was, but everything was Mike regurgitated and repackaged. And there was a couple people that you would just say were mini Mikes who are still there today. Mike had this subtle thing, though, that made this possible. I think made this happen. Now, I may have mentioned it before. I can't remember, but he would always say this phrase, and I think I've heard you talk about this with Branham. He would say that my copyright's your right to copy. And he had a Times New Roman teaching template that you show it to any IHOPper or ex-IHOPper today and they'll cringe, because that's how we were taught to make teaching notes. And we knew that Mike, whenever Mike put his teaching notes, they would talk about it like in back rooms and stuff. I don't know if he ever talked about it from the platform, but Mike would literally just copy and paste pieces from other messages and piece them together to make new messages. So you might see from 4 weeks ago that he talked about sin, or the impacts of sin on the world. And he had to have his 3 things, rage of Satan and all this kind of stuff that he would use as explanations. And then you would see it 3 weeks later, pasted in another thing. And so we were taught as IHOP-U students that we could teach right from Mike's notes, that we could take it. We wouldn't have to come up with stuff on our own. And so that caused you to own it in a way. It caused you not to engage things critically. But Mike would turn around and say, to check things out for yourself and don't be so open-minded that your brain falls out. Like he would say subtle things like that would make you think, okay, I'm being critical. I am. And one of the other phrases that came up recently that I didn't realize was a little bit of a NAR phenomenon, NAR, was the meat and bones little phrase, to eat the meat and spit out the bones. One of my friends was reading the Holly, I think her name's Holly Pivick, book that she did on the NAR. And that was one of the phrases that she talked about in her book, that they would say to eat the meat and spit out the bones. And what that did, it shut down critical thought again, of if I had an objection to something Mike said, and then he turned around and he knows, he was a socially intelligent guy. So like if he said something, he could read a room and know that it didn't sit right. And he would say, well, just eat the meat and spit out the bones, like eat the good part that you agree with and just ignore the rest. But we realized ignoring the rest was what kept the system afloat. That's what did it. So yeah, that's some of the stuff I've been chewing on and spitting out the bones.
In Branhamism, it's eat the cherry pie and spit out the seeds, but it's the same exact concept.
This pie's the pits.
Yeah. But I'm really glad that you brought up that topic, because a lot of people really miss that as a manipulation technique. The fact that you have to own it. That is one of the most powerful techniques of manipulation in a cult that exists, because if you can get a group of people, lead them to what you want them to say, and then have them say it and own it, well, now they have to back down from it, or otherwise they have to humble their pride and eat some eat some humble pie.
Yeah.
And so that is the best manipulation technique. Then you get a group of pillars who are lifting you up, and very few of those pillars are going to fall, because there are very few people that will admit they're wrong, and they know that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing this today. Like I said, we had so many people asking for you to come back, and I have a feeling there'll be quite a few more topics we'll have to get into.
Sounds good. Anytime. Thanks for having me, John.
Awesome. Well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an overview of the historical research of William Branham and the healing revivals, you can read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.